Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Caribbean Actuarial Association's 2021 virtual conference, with attendees and disruptors from across the world joining us to continue embracing the disruption. My name is Soraya Baksh, and I'll be interviewing our keynote speaker, Kirk Anthony Hamilton. Hi, Kirk Anthony, in our keynote address entitled The Disruptive Entrepreneur. This session is expected to last around 45 minutes, including the time that we will leave at the end for a brief Q&A session. But before we get started, I'd like to remind you of a few housekeeping items. Questions can be submitted through the Q&A window, and I will share the questions with Kirk Anthony during the designated Q&A period. Please minimize sending any messages through the chat window if there are questions. Feel free to chat amongst yourselves in the chat window, but if there's a question for Kirk Anthony, just try to use the Q&A. Thank you. This session will be recorded and uploaded to the CAA website and ActiveView. This may include Q&A and chat responses. Extracts may also be shared on social media platforms. By registering for this conference and attending this session, you're giving permission to the CAA to use any text, photograph, or video taken during this virtual event. But on a lighter note, this would not be a Caribbean conference without some entertainment. We have a fun-filled virtual social events package for you, including a cocktail party, a pub quiz, karaoke, yoga, dance exercise, and a talent show. So show off your talent at Actuary's Got Talent or any of our other activities to win prizes. Don't forget to follow us on social media at Caribbean Actuarial Association on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram. And finally, thank you to all of our sponsors and conference partners. Without you, this year's conference would not have been possible. Now the moment that you've all been waiting for. So let's meet our keynote speaker. Kirk Anthony Hamilton is an architectural designer turned entrepreneur, investor, community curator, and founder of the Infinity Partnership, Inc., Tech Beach Retreat, and the Destination Experience. He's on a mission to build a new global business ecosystem for the Caribbean, with platforms designed to attract investment, innovation, influence, and big media to the region, with an aim to catalyze new enterprise and wealth creation opportunities. Participants in his knowledge and opportunity exchange platforms collectively control in excess of $140 billion in equity and investment capital. And to date, they have seeded over $300 million in investments across various sectors. In May of 2015, Kirk Anthony was celebrated as one of 75 emerging global entrepreneurs by President Obama at the White House. And in January of 2016, serving as curator of the Global Shapers Kingston Hub, he was selected as one of 50 global shapers to participate in the annual meeting of the World Economic Forum. Most recently, in October 2021, he was recognized as one of the 100 most influential people of African descent under 40 for business and entrepreneurship. His work and profile have been featured in publications including Forbes, Wall Street Journal, Essence, and the New York Times. Kirk Anthony possesses a professional Master of Architecture degree from the Savannah College of Art and Design. So Kirk Anthony, that's quite an impressive bio. And before we get started, I just want to pause and thank you very much for being here with us. We definitely appreciate it, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing your insights.
Thank you for having me. I'm beyond honored for the opportunity to share.
Well, to kick us off, do you mind sharing your vision with us and a bit about how you got started on this entrepreneurial adventure?
Okay, well, in the context of this conversation, I guess there's a vision that I have that simply centers around a better Caribbean, a more fruitful, productive, innovative Caribbean that can embrace all of her people in an environment that allows people to really be able to capture their own individuality, ambitions, and such, and really be able to pursue excellence. And so, my entrepreneurial journey has seen me set out on a path where we ultimately create platforms that allow us to drive these visions along the lines of areas of interest specific to me and my partners, and areas of interest that we see as most potent for the region, right? So when we look at spaces like technology and we realize that there's a level of inertia or lack of movement in that industry, we look to create a platform that will allow the conversation to be driven forward. And then we participate in various business opportunities that match our skill set and our ability to add value once we've created the platforms. So we've done this across a couple different industries. Primarily, I would say tech being a main one that we're very well known for with our platform Tech Beach. We've done things across finance and real estate and energy as well. But then the other area that we're becoming most known for is healthcare. And that's become obviously very, very important in the current time and has fed into the momentum that we're driving in that space as well.
So if we were to focus in a little bit on Tech Beach Retreat, can you share with us, what is it all about?
So Tech Beach was founded as simply a vision to connect our Caribbean ecosystem with the global space. So, I was involved a few years ago, well, a few years now, back in 2012 in an investment firm based in Florida. We looked to raise capital in the Caribbean to deploy into North America in primarily digital media companies. And we raised a couple $1 million, but it was a very challenging road. And one of the things that I realized on that journey was how disconnected from what I felt was happening in the rest of the world it seemed like our, corporate entities and such were in the region, because we raised capital, we were able to buy into a couple of these firms. At the time, these were app developers that were doing work for some Fortune 500 entities in the US and other markets. And when we tried to bring that conversation into the Caribbean, it was very difficult, right? So as I looked on, I kind of realized that, we tend to end up trying to start at the end instead of the beginning. So our journey with Tech Beach was really saying, look, the ecosystem in the market is lacking. We're not really talking about this kind of information right now in the Caribbean. So this was back in 2016, funny enough. We weren't really talking about tech and scaling and, disruption. And even from back then, I had kind of said to people that, the funny thing is I feel like in the next 5 years, innovation and disruption will finally become pitch words in the Caribbean, which would be somewhat outdated compared to many other markets, right? And to an extent, so said, so done. We've been met by, the challenges of COVID. But when it came to Tech Beach, what we really set out to do was, we said, surrounding the Caribbean, there are all these global forces that are, to an extent, gatekeepers, to an extent, enablers of any level of growth in the tech space. And in order for our people to be able to truly participate, there has to be a connection point with these global entities, minds, investors, etc., and vice versa. We need to be able to open our people up to the opportunity to be able to participate in these platforms as well. And so the concept started out fairly simply, just taking advantage of what was already here. We have very nice beaches, great all-inclusive resorts, and we just said we're going to invite a bunch of people to the Caribbean to come and talk about tech. And hence the name Tech Beach. For the tech community in Silicon Valley and these other markets, it was something that, to an extent was a no-brainer, right? Everybody's response to us was pretty much, you don't have to sell me too hard. You said my two favorite things, tech and beach in the same sentence is a beautiful thing. And so from a very early stage, we had some level of success and some level of showing that what we were saying was possible. Fast forward to now, we've built an entity that is pretty well recognized in a lot of the markets that I just mentioned, Silicon Valley and such. We've hosted, brilliant minds from around the world, including Jack Dorsey, who is the co-founder and CEO of Twitter and Square. He just stepped down from being the CEO of Twitter, as you may have seen in the news. We've hosted the founder of Vonage. We've hosted executives from places like Google, etc. And we've also partnered with a lot of these entities. So we have partnerships with Google, AWS, MasterCard, Stripe. We tend to say, you name it, typically we have a relationship with them. And very often what happens is we become a conduit for these brands because many of them don't have physical representation on the ground in the Caribbean. So when they decide that they're going to work with us and give some level of benefit to the people in our community who are from the region or look to partner with people from the region, it typically is doing so without much presence in the market, which is something that we take strong note of because that's a big part of the feat in terms of what we've achieved. But yes, that's Tech Beach in a nutshell. We launched an accelerator program last year, and I guess it's pretty fitting to this conversation for everyone here to understand, what we would have had was a very physical business despite our focus on tech. In 2020 alone, we were across various platforms to host about 10 different summits across the region. So we would have been tapping Barbados, Jamaica, Cayman, Bermuda. This year, we were to enter the Bahamas and Martinique. All of that has been crushed. We actually don't do events in the sense of what we used to do anymore at all. We don't even try to stage things like what I'm participating in here today. And so I don't, jump on the term pivot all the time, but we definitely had to change the way we were working and pursue some different objectives, but leveraging the same set of principles that have built what we had to start with.
That makes a lot of sense. And I pick up on something there that you say where the Caribbean has this natural attraction because of the beautiful beaches and that sort of thing. Now, I know a part of your message is also a little bit of rebranding to say, hey, we're more than just that. So can you expand a bit on how you think we can change the way we're perceived from the outside?
Yeah, for sure. So I'll touch on that in two ways. So for us, Tech Beach was a bit of that rebranding as a name, right? It was, I said to my partners from day one, listen, if we launch the Caribbean Tech Association, based on the current frame of the region, I didn't feel like we'd get much buy-in. So a name like Tech Beach merged the kind of content we wanted to deliver with a sense of what people already appreciate about our market. I think one of the big challenges that the Caribbean faces that we have yet to, whether we understand it or have really calculated around it, is how we are represented globally and how people see us. So I usually say we're seen in two ways. We're either seen as these beautiful island nations with wonderful beaches that you go to relax. And so when you speak to international business interests, oftentimes that is where their headspace is when they think of the Caribbean. It's like, okay, well, if you're inviting me to come and hang out and take my family on a trip, that sounds wonderful, but they have no sense of what the business ecosystem really looks like in the market. So even, when I heard the welcome, listening to some of those names like Sagicor, etc., people don't fully understand what these brands reflect at a local level and also their capacity at scale internationally, right? So that's one side of it. But then the other side of it is, I feel like we're also seen as then just poor, desolate nations that don't deliver scale, right? And Jamaica in particular kind of gets boxed into that space where, again, people don't understand what else we have to offer. And a big part of the challenge with this is how we've been portrayed in the media, right? And some of it is our doing, some of it is the doing of these same global forces that we try to speak to on a regular. So we've been, featured in Forbes and Inc. and these different publications, just talking about the other side of the Caribbean that you don't usually hear about. But I really do think that it is one of the greatest challenges that we face when you think about building real capacity in the market and scaling up businesses and really being able to tap into certain levels of opportunity, right? We are not seen as the first choice in a conversation when people are either looking to identify capital, looking at a business opportunity, when people are building globally relevant solutions that many times the Caribbean doesn't even come to mind for them as a place that they could pursue for their venture. And, we all want to be able to participate in a global space. I think it's a characteristic of Caribbean people that we love to know that we can enter markets like Canada and the US, and our children may be able to live there and have a better life, etc. But we don't think enough about what's happening on the ground and our ability to invite in some of the same level of thinking, resources, etc. that we're looking outside for to participate in our local economy and help to drive the transformation that we see.
That that concept of moving past what you're defined as, I think, could also be applied even more specifically to the actuaries too. So, I was looking at a TED Talk by Dominic Lee recently, and I know that you also know him. And the TED Talk was about moving actuaries beyond insurance. So sort of changing the perception actuaries belong in insurance, and just moving past that. He mentioned that for him, the first obstacle was mindset. And I know you talk a lot about mindset as well. So can you connect the dots for us?
Yes, for sure. So as you know, Dominic Lee is actually a very good friend. And, I also watched the same speech. And so I came in here today with a bit of understanding, just based on even talking to Dominic and listening to him, in the sense of how do you take the skill set and capacity that actuaries have and really apply it elsewhere. I'll tell you, I rarely wear my glasses. I decided to wear them today because I know I'm addressing a very brilliant audience at the end of the day. And that is something that you then have to figure out. How do you take this thing, package it, and apply it elsewhere, but really be able to take advantage of it, right? Mindset is, I think, one of our also greatest challenges in the Caribbean, on the sense that, I usually say to people, more and more we're hearing about human capital development. I think the Caribbean is at an earlier stage where we need to focus a bit more on human capital empowerment, right? You'll hear me talk a lot about things like individualism and people being able to pursue their ambitions, etc. As a region, we don't have the fortunate history of being told this concept of you can, right? And so the mindset that people tend to approach life in, or life with, tends to be within this box, and that box has a certain levels of limitations, right? It's cliche to say you need to think outside the box at this point, but the reality is, when you grow up in a system that tells you, this is how things work, and you also grow up in a system where when you try to break the boundaries of how things work, in many cases you might be either punished for it or just simply stalled. No one looks to help make the road any easier. That is a very challenging thing to go up against, right? And so equally, there's a need for people's mindsets to change in the sense of their ability to do, right? And really believing in that and finding that path. But also for those, we tend to call them enablers. Those who are in the positions to open these doors and make things, whether easier or just clearer, taking on that path. So I think, when you and I spoke sometime last week, we spoke about the difference between, risk management and risk prevention, right? I see actuaries in a space of trying to do something that is very general to business. As much as I am, an entrepreneur, and we talk about disruption and everything like that, I also end up in discussions very often about risk, and our ability to manage risk is where our success comes from, right? And that to me, and as Dominic would have put it, is the underlying concept of what you all are experts at. The question is, how do you now parlay that in a way that just starts to say to people, we have the ability to help ensure that ideas, concepts, businesses that are growing, etc., see success, as opposed to the view that says we are stopping something from happening, right? And we understand what is going to make this not work, so we're going to put the barriers in place to ensure that it doesn't go in this direction. And that's the big shift in mindset that I think is not only necessary in the actuarial world, but it's necessary generally in our market, for people to start existing outside the frame and realizing that, there's 7 billion people on the planet. I say to folks, with 7 billion people in the world, it's hard to imagine how any one viewpoint or any one way of doing things can ever be seen in an absolute manner, right? That's one of the challenges that I think as well we face, that we need to overcome. And it is a mindset issue where people see things in this very absolute way that says you can't do certain things in various fashions. So something like Tech Beach as a name becomes very abnormal, right? as opposed to, I'm an individual, I have a vision. I think it's a great vision. Many around the world have embraced the vision. And at the end of the day, all I've done is we've been successful at scaling that vision to people who think it matters. For all the others that don't think it matters, there are other solutions for them, and that's great. But I exist in a world where I've been able to take my message to others who see things the same as me, right? And that's the important thing for anyone pursuing anything in my mind.
I know we have a lot of young people on the webinar today, perhaps a lot of actuarial students as well. And so I think that's a very strong message that you're saying, is just believe that you can do it. And if you have an idea, don't necessarily throw it out the window because you get a little bit of resistance. Truly believe in it and push for it. How do you turn ideas into actions now?
That's a big one. In a market like ours, turning ideas into action requires a significant level of persistence. But I think, welcome as well. We're now in a world that is very open, and people need to understand that and embrace it. So my playbook for success has been that we've managed to create these connections outside the market in many instances, and formulate, we formulated these platforms that we then bring back home, but they are driven by a certain level of global influence, and they're well-resourced from other parties around the world. That may not be the strategy for everyone, but what I think I would say is, one, turning ideas into action is just doing, right? One of the biggest challenges people face is that they come up with things, but then they don't try to move. And you will learn and realize in life in general, I have found that the moment you start to actually move, you will develop some level of natural momentum, because even if you hit roadblocks, right? As an entrepreneur, you start to understand that your role is simply to try and get around those roadblocks, right? So I always say to people, it takes a certain level of craziness to be an entrepreneur, at least as I've seen it and experienced, because what happens to me in my life very often is that I hit the biggest hurdle. Somebody tells me flat out no, and it's something that we may have envisioned as being this great thing and whatnot. And you go to sleep kind of disturbed by the day's events. And you wake up the next morning thinking, you know what? That happened because we weren't going big enough. Here's how we need to go about it today, right? And all of a sudden we're trying to do more. I think that is a very necessary attitude. I don't encourage anyone to be, what would be the term? You don't want to be operating blindly, right? And you certainly don't want to be operating outside of the quote unquote scope of reality. But you also have to be able to somewhat balance that with the understanding that outside successes don't exist in the realm of reality, right? Like we don't consider them outsized. We don't consider people generally successful until they have achieved things that exist outside of what we consider normal, right? So your pursuit ultimately has to be, something that goes beyond what tradition says is okay. In terms of how you really move things forward, I would say whatever the idea is, my approach tends to be creating somewhat of a marketplace for ideas, right? So, my business is centered around how many hands can I shake, right? But I also say to people when it comes to networking, right, that my focus is not on the quantity of hands, but also the level of access that I really gain. So if you meet a bunch of people and you can't pick up the phone and call them, or if they don't respond to your emails, then you really haven't achieved much. So it is the ability to build relationships, somewhat qualify yourself. You will qualify yourself in one of two ways. Either it is on what you would like to do and selling a sense of the character behind you that is hoping to achieve this. And then at some point you start transitioning to selling yourself on the basis of your experience, right? Because now people can buy into that credibility. And so you go along that journey. but constantly trying to create a bigger and bigger marketplace for your ideas to exist in, so that you don't suffer the consequence of what is a very big Caribbean challenge, which is the perceived limitation, at least, of how many people can I talk to, or how many people can really help this go along. So that's one thing that we try to take into account with everything that we do, is just bringing it as far as we can.
Mm-hmm. And there's also that idea of failing forward. So not being afraid of failure, go for it, learn from it, try again. I find that very powerful as well.
Oh, definitely. You know, there's obviously a culture, and I won't just say it's in the Caribbean, but there is a culture that tends to look down on failure. You know, but most people can tell you, anyone who's successful tends to say failure is their greatest drive, right? As I mentioned earlier, you know, I fail and I wake up the next day thinking, okay, what's the bigger thing that we can now try to achieve based on this not going the way that we expected? So that's a huge one for sure. And for the encouragement of those that you mentioned earlier, I would just always say, you know, you start to realize in life that, or you need to realize in life that you're in the driver's seat of yours, right? And no one else is. So we tend to take on the load of the feeling of failure and the perception of what everybody must be thinking, even though a lot of times one person told me something couldn't work, right? But all of a sudden I think, you know, everyone in the world is saying it can't work. And that's not the case, right? So when I look on at markets like North America, which are very consumerist in their approach, you know, there's a reason that people are able to sell things like, you know, what's something crazy that, you know, and these days I can't even think of.
Honestly, the fidget spinner thing comes to mind. You know, that little thing that they would.
A friend of mine once to me years. I something like that, right? So whatever it may be, you tend to find, right, that people are able to find their market. You just have to push to find your market. And some people will think you're silly. Other people will think, you know what, I want to be able to chop vegetables a lot easier in a single tool that you have put on television somehow. That makes, you know, somehow my life easier, or any of these things that, you know, I think in our market, even me, you tend to look at as luxury, right? Like these things that cook eggs, for example, and you're like, well, why don't we just boil the eggs ourselves? But all that those people have done, if you really think about it, is they found their market. And it doesn't matter that I, as Kirk, will probably never buy the toaster that has a little piece on top that allows me to cook the egg at the same time. I'm just not who their market is, right? And so that's the big push I would encourage anyone here who it is relevant to understand, is that there is no one entity, person, etc., that really can limit you in the broader scope of the world, whether it be government, corporations, individuals, etc. And that's how I go about, you know, my thinking daily.
You know, I wanna bring us back probably to almost at the very beginning of our conversation, where we talk about the Caribbean. So we've addressed a few of the challenges. So we talked about the mindset and that sort of thing, but let's talk about the unique value proposition and the benefits of investing in the Caribbean and why you've chosen to promote the regions. Can you talk about some of the unique advantages that we have?
Oh, for sure. I mean, I'll tell you, funny enough, I think I mentioned earlier, I'm in Barbados at the moment. So I'm Jamaican, but I spend a lot of time between Jamaica and Barbados. Yesterday, I was out for a friend's birthday. You know, the lifestyle that we can afford to people in this market is very different to anything that they'll find anywhere else in the world. We tend to promote, and COVID is kind of changing this, but what we've promoted to the world is a short course version of that, right? Come here for 3 weeks or 2 weeks, sorry. You know, our greatest focus actually has been on these 1 week stays and such like that, but we haven't done as well at promoting life in the market. But the reality is we have a great product to offer, and a relatively diverse product, which the world looks for, right? So what you experience in Barbados is very different to what you'll get in Jamaica, is different to Cayman, Bermuda, you know, Antigua, etc. So that's one critical thing. We are small. It is undeniable that we're small, but I think we also have fit into a myth that says scale drives success, right? Which isn't always the case. So yes, there's a value to existing in a grand market, but the reality for me is that the majority of wealthy countries in the world, when you look at the top 10, they're not all the US and China, right? There are a lot of relatively small nations that are quite wealthy and have done well in the world. So you look at places like Switzerland and Norway, etc. They don't have massive populations. The same for me with somewhere like Israel. Israel has 9 million people. Now, clearly that's way more than most Caribbean islands. It's 3 times the largest English-speaking Caribbean island, which is Jamaica. But Israel has also been plagued with certain challenges for my entire lifetime that, you know, until I visited there, I struggled to understand, well, in Jamaica, we focus so much on crime, right? Which we need to solve, but we focus so much on crime as our problem. And then you have a nation like this that seems to thrive, right? That somehow has become well known in the world of tech and innovation as, like, you know, one of the smartest places that you can go to. And how are they managing this duality of brand, right? So we also have pretty smart people. You know, I know you're broadcasting from Europe, right? And somehow it is that when we exit the confines of this space, we seemingly tend to thrive, right? So selling our people, I think, is one big thing that we need to do better at, and focus on, again, creating this larger marketplace. We don't only create great tourism workers who can give a smile and shake a hand and serve a nice cold drink to people at a hotel. We have brilliant minds in the market who could service opportunities globally. We are fortunate, based on all of these challenges, that we tend to be a more affordable market, right? Now, what we need to focus on is how to not make affordability mean cheap, and find a balance between offering the world a resource that is more cost effective while still being meaningful to the people who are then providing that resource to the rest of the world, right? And then one thing that I think we have that we don't leverage enough, but it is based on our size as well, is a certain level of regulatory agility, right? Which we do not do, but we could do. You know, I remember speaking to a gentleman years ago in the Isle of Man, and he was saying to me that, you know, the way that they look at their, I guess, advantage in the world is, while they're tiny, they have the ability to regulate quickly, right? Mm-hmm. And so the more regulatory frameworks that they can sell to the world and move quickly on them as things adjust in the market, is the better off they've become. We need to take greater levels of advantage of that, because that is one of the best selling points that the Caribbean has to offer. We see it in places like Bermuda, Cayman, Barbados, but we need to figure out finding that balance between offering value and, you know, quote unquote exploitation, which is how sometimes things are seen, right? There's obvious value to be created, but how do we do it in a way that doesn't sell the message that just says, you know, we are here for extraction, as opposed to, you know, we can add value into the world, and, you know, you should pay us handsomely for the value that we're creating.
Right.
And then that gets distributed to our people. That's the ultimate goal at the end of the day.
Absolutely. I'm just aware that I'm seeing quite a few questions in the chat, so why don't we turn over to the audience Q&A and see what sort of questions have come in. So one person is saying that in Trinidad and Tobago, the central bank doesn't let you get foreign exchange for investment, but focuses on consumption instead. Do you have any suggestions?
Wow, that's a tricky one, and I certainly don't want to speak against any central bank, but I guess this is the challenge of our market generally, right? And they obviously have conditions that they're fighting that have led to the foreign exchange challenge that Trinidad also faces. You know, what I would say as the simplest answer, but again, I'm not there, but I will say I'm actually looking at doing a deal in Trinidad as well, and faced with the same challenge and trying to figure it out. And so we've thought through a few different ways, right? I mean, one, there are treaties in CARICOM that allow you to have a business outside of, let's say, Trinidad that is operating within Trinidad, and that may be a structure to attract your investment, right? There are also stock exchanges like Jamaica Stock Exchange that exists outside Trinidad, but you could be operational in Trinidad, and it allows you a gateway to offloading some level of liquidity to your investors over time, while taking advantage of whatever you actually see as the market in Trinidad. And obviously it presents its own advantages despite the foreign exchange challenges and such. So those are two ways that I can mention. I guess at the end of the day, I don't know the scale of what the question is asking about. And so that's clearly for more established operations. But in the startup space, for example, when it comes to tech, with our programs, we've seen a lot of Caribbean businesses. And again, this is not my encouragement, but I think you reach a point where you realize that people need to be able to operate, right? And hopefully our governments start to realize the challenges that are in front of them and try to create real solutions. So a lot of people more and more are just registering businesses in markets that are embracing them, like the United Arab Emirates or the US, where they can do this all online, right? And so again, you're to an extent taking advantage of your home market, but you're leveraging a resource that is outside of the market, right? That's one other way, and that's easy for a startup to do, right? You don't have to be very big to go down that road.
Right. This other one is a point that I think we might have discussed last week, but how do you build cross-Caribbean relationships that we tend to be so sort of insular and isolated?
So, I've been very fortunate. I travel a lot, and I've built my relationships in a very good way. But over time, once you develop a reputation, it becomes easier, and the conversations can happen without the physical side of things. But, again, to me, the idea is a big part of what I've achieved has been on my willingness to express what I want to achieve, right? So I've reached out to people saying, this is what I'm doing, and this is what success looks like for us if we can achieve it, and effectively invite them to participate in some way. And we get tons of no's, right? I've gotten no's left, right, and center for as long as I can remember. But at the same time, the bright spark and why I can sit on this call today smiling is we also get some yeses, right? And when the yeses come, they're good. So the idea to me would simply need to be, reaching beyond the market. The good thing about the Caribbean being reasonably small is that it's not hard to identify or get a sense of who are some of the larger operators in the region to then at least try to start leveraging some folks within these entities as your point of connection, right? But I say to people a lot, one of the things that we need in the region more and more is folks who have regional capacity, right? Because the region is what's going to offer us the scale that not only are we looking for, but outside resources tend to be looking for, right? So the reason that these, like I was mentioning earlier, the partners like Google, et cetera, look to an organization like ours is because, physical or not, we have a footprint throughout the region, right? We can get to most governments, we can get to a lot of large corporates, et cetera. And so we're an easy conduit for them to, kind of tap into and work with. And for all that we're offering, I would say we're relatively cost effective, right? Everything that I sold earlier. So I think, building regional capacity needs to be something that young people try to invest themselves in. I usually give this anecdote of when Jamaicans come to Barbados or when Trinidadians come to Barbados for UE, what they get exposed to is a very different Barbados than, for example, the Barbados I know. And so you have to invest yourself into reaching beyond the environment that you are caught in for whatever purpose that holds, right? I'll just tell you, as an entrepreneur, I don't come from the worst background ever, but I don't come from the greatest background ever, right? Either. And so I've had many uncomfortable instances. I've invited many people to lunch where I didn't really know exactly how I'd pay for other things after taking them to lunch. I've, traveled on a dime that I didn't have. Like there is a certain level of sacrifice that you have to put in. But you also have to know what the reward you're looking for is. And so one of the things that I saw from a relatively early stage was that I felt like the market was disconnected. And I wanted to be in a position where I could better pull on forces from around the region, and ultimately then be able to sell, I think now we're in a position to sell almost anything, right? But we have capacity in different islands, and people who trust us, etc. But that's taken time to build.
Right. We have a question. How do you make Mia Mottley Prime Minister of the Caribbean? I think I will spare you. You don't have to answer that one. But that's a good question. What are your thoughts on how we in the Caribbean should deal with climate change?
That's an interesting one. So I guess that points back to a figure like Mia Mottley, who I admire greatly, and I've known her for probably about 10 years. I met Mia before she was prime minister or anything like that, and she was quite helpful to me in my career. But I participate in a lot of global forums, including the World Economic Forum. And one of the conversations I have, I won't say often because climate change is not something yet that I have tackled in an immediate sense. But I do believe in what is happening, and I believe that we are the most susceptible region in the world when it comes to climate change. Unfortunately, and this is the shift that needs to happen, Mia Mottley kind of did it in Scotland the other day, right? We need to position ourselves not only as the folks in need, but to an extent, we need to find a way to start being the pioneers as well, and somewhat position ourselves as a global hub for solutions around climate change, right? We can't continue to sit in this kind of back seat that says, there's a problem out there that you all are creating that is now having an effect on us, and you need to fix it, as opposed to, we're working to solve it ourselves. And so one of the kind of interesting dualities that I found with the speech that Prime Minister Mottley gave the other day was, it's great for us to go on this stage and champion this cause, and I'm all for it. But at the same time, we need to see what's going on the ground, right? It is very difficult in any Caribbean island to set up a solar farm, for example, right? Why is that? When then you're saying, this is the great challenge that the world needs to fix, but we're not then, we should be the number one solar energy generator in the world. And there are a lot of studies that support the idea that is our place in the world, and it is a very real thing that we could become in relatively short order. But for some reason, on the other side of what I'm saying is, we've put a lot of barriers in place to anyone really being able to champion that vision or buy into it, for that matter. So I would say some of those things need to change, but that is how I would want to see the Caribbean position herself, or itself, whichever one.
I think you might have answered this one a little bit before, which is talking about the bureaucracy that stifles small business growth in the Caribbean.
Yes.
One person is asking, sorry, go ahead. You wanted to add something to that?
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think there's a balance in that when it comes to the challenge of bureaucracy and doing business, and the need for us as people to innovate and center ourselves in finding ways around linear concept. And none of these concepts that people admire as well follow a very straight path, right? They're all challenged. So Google, Uber, all these ideas that we fascinate around. I think we are a very centralized region in the way that we think about things. So, you talk to most or many small business entrepreneurs, and the first thing that they respond to you saying is, they would be successful if government did X, right? And it's kind of like, you know, what you usually find with a lot of these enterprises that we look onto is their focus is not on government, right? And you don't have a responsibility as a business in any way, really, outside of your natural obligations based on the regulations of your country. You don't really have any obligation to leaning to the government or depending on the government. But we have a very government dependent somewhat mindset. So every solution is designed around something that then needs to include government. And, you know, we collaborate with a lot of government entities, but we've also found our success in working with those who are willing to work with us, right? So there are many instances where you may have a government entity with a mandate that seems aligned with what we're doing, and they opt not to work with us. And we continue doing what we're doing, and we find success. And we have many, many stories of points where we developed enough momentum where the tides shift, right? And it becomes them coming to us saying, we see what you're doing. This is our mandate. We need to work with you, right? Mm-hmm. And so my encouragement here is not saying that the barriers don't exist. I spoke about it. Bureaucracy is a big, big, big problem in the Caribbean. But a part of the bureaucracy issue in the Caribbean is also how we look at it. And we need to spend some time focused on figuring out how to navigate around it and innovate around it, as opposed to allowing it to be this wall that just stops us from getting anywhere.
Right. But I think we might be a bit close on time, so I will just ask you to perhaps give the audience one actionable takeaway from everything that we've discussed. And I know we could probably keep talking for another few hours. There's so much we didn't touch on, but what would you say?
Actionable item. That's a tricky one. You know, I guess I'll just go back to my earlier comments, which is just do it. If, you know, and I guess that's Nike's phrase, but if you are in pursuit of something, the ultimate objective you should have is to start. Too many of us exist with our ideas on either paper or in our brains, and we don't. I think it's a matter of fear that prevents us from starting to put it out into the world. And so I would say, as many do, there is no clear formula. That's something that you also learn. What worked for one will not necessarily work for the other. But what everyone can tell you is you have to get started. Because until you get started, you don't fully understand whether it is that this is a great concept or it is that it's going to be heavily challenged. You don't fully understand what the market's response is going to be. But once you start getting the market's response, you are now in a position to actually take the driver's seat and start deciding how you want to maneuver around the challenges, et cetera, that are presented, / the opportunities that may open up themselves. I'll just close by saying, you know, what Tech Beach looks like now, and I'll say quite frankly, what my life looks like now is very different to what I ever envisioned, despite my, you know, long-standing desire to be a quote-unquote successful entrepreneur. What I do now is not necessarily what I thought when I was a teenager, et cetera, that I was going to be doing in order to build any level of success, right? So, you know, going down that path is the most important thing, because then you start to understand things a lot better.
Well, Cook Anthony, thank you so much. This was extremely insightful. I hope our audience have appreciated the session today. We got so many questions that we couldn't even answer, so I know people were engaged and were definitely buying into your message. Thanks again.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. It was an honor. I really appreciated the opportunity. Thank you.
So for everyone else, if you want to connect to the next session, it's our actuaries needed in the Caribbean. We have a short debate session. You can press leave in this webinar, head into the lobby, and then connect into the following session. So see you there.